The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations.
1/3 of all murder cases in America remain open.
He had told me that if I opened my eyes, he would slit my throat.
Each one is called a cold case.
The DNA evidence taken from the victim was a match. The Linden rapist was at it again.
Based on the hit A&E television program.
A phone call is placed, one that changes a family's life forever.
Cold Case Files, the podcast.
You could see the fire in his eyes. He screamed at me, "You want it? Get your tape recorder out."
Get new episodes of Cold Case Files every Tuesday on Podcast One, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you listen to podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we finish our coverage of the Casey Anthony case and talk about theories. Everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my preeminent co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. What a nice word to end this long day with. You know, today was a day that our air conditioning cut out at our office, but I had so much work to do and people kept calling me. So by the time I left the office, my office had reached something like 89 or 90 degrees. And I was like literally like a boiling frog, you know, where you put the frog in the water and slowly heat it up and the frog doesn't know to jump out. That's what I felt like. So I'm just glad to have made it out of the, so to speak, boiling pot to be here with you, to be your co-host at all.
Well, as Alice knows, there was a water main that broke in my office, so my office is currently being renovated. So I did not stay at work today. With the no office and no air conditioning, I worked from home. So, you know, advantage of COVID, we now have that capability. And that was good because I was not going to stay in the office given my unique circumstances. But whatever, these are the challenges we face in public service. You're welcome, world.
Anything for justice. But it's all I'm saying is I'm very glad to be recording with you in my air-conditioned closet.
I am too, Alice. And speaking of justice, we are talking today more about a case in which most people think justice was not done as we continue our look at the Casey Anthony case. Last time we looked at a lot of the evidence that came in this case, and we are nearing sort of the conclusion of our substantive look at this. And then we're going to take as much time as we need to talk about the theories in this case, because I think when you think about the theories and you talk about the theories, you really have to kind of dig back into some stuff to really come up with what I think at least are the likely scenarios for what happened. But last time we talked about the defense's theory, and the defense's theory is one of both an accident that happened to Caylee where Caylee drowned in the pool and a cover-up orchestrated not by Casey Anthony, but by George Anthony, and the accusations that were made against him in the opening statement by the defense, which he then had a very, very early opportunity to address.
Indeed. So, as we said, George testified. In fact, George is the first witness of the entire trial. The prosecution asks him if he ever sexually abused his daughter. So they addressed the defense's argument head on by asking the question directly to him. And kind of unsurprisingly, George said no. He also said that he knew nothing about Caylee's death. on cross-examination, Jose Baez, the defense attorney, doesn't ask about sexual abuse. Instead, he focuses on George's attempted suicide shortly after Caylee was found. The defense attempts to use this to prove that George was feeling guilty for his role in Caylee's death and cover-up.
And this is really interesting that Baez would make this shocking allegation. And if you listen to the opening statement by the defense, I mean, it's brutal. It's not just he sexually abused his daughter. I mean, Baez is going into detail about the things he would do to Casey and how this was a chronic thing that happened really her entire life. Also accused her brother Lee of assaulting her at least once. And you would expect, if you're going to do that in an opening argument, that when your very first opportunity to question a witness is the witness you just accused of sexually abusing his daughter, that you would spend some time on that. But Baez doesn't do it. He doesn't mention it. And in fact, he never really mentions it again. And they get all the way to the closing argument, and prosecution basically moves that he shouldn't be able to mention it in an argument, because even though he's said something about it in the opening, he's provided absolutely no evidence of it throughout the rest of the trial. And the judge sustains that sort of motion in limine to prevent Baez from being able to talk about this in closing argument, because he hasn't actually laid the foundation. And it's a really interesting thing, because we've talked about this before. Ordinarily, if you say it in your opening statement and then you don't back it up, that's something the jury is going to punish you for. Obviously, that doesn't happen here. And Alice, I don't know what you think about that or this strategy, but it's sort of a unique one.
It's a really bold strategy, right? Because he makes such a bold, shocking claim in his opening statement. And we've said this a lot. You have to be careful what you promise in opening statement. Now, I do think this actually applies more to the prosecution than the defense. But if you are going to promise some evidence is going to come out before the jury, then you should provide that. The jury is kind of sitting on their edge and they're waiting to hear it. Now, I also think it's very sneaky, because you've laid the groundwork of what your story is going to be. And we've used this analogy in past cases in talking about an opening statement. It's like building the shelves, and then the evidence as it comes out during trial is put on the shelves, but you build the framework in which you want to tell your story. So in a lot of ways, Baez already built the shelf. It's in some ways immovable in the jurors' heads. They are associating the entire theory behind George being abusive towards his daughter. And these shelves have already been filled up, so to speak, with evidence. And this motion in limine, which just means that outside of the presence of the jury, the judge is granting an order saying that Baez cannot bring in or argue this piece of, or really lack of evidence of abuse. Now, that's almost like it's a construct, right? Because the evidence is already on the shelf that he helped build for the jury in the opening statement. But now he just doesn't talk about, say, the entire structure of the shelf, but it's there in their minds already because the evidence fits within that framework. So I think it's very bold and a little bit sneaky as well. Because here's the thing, it wasn't a mistake that he did not ask George about abuse. It was a very intentional evasion of that subject, in fact. And it's almost like he baited the prosecution into it so that the jurors had heard questions about sexual abuse. And maybe he's relying on kind of the psychological connection where someone's already said that there was sexual abuse and there were questions asked of him. And even though the answer was in the negative, someone's already heard, well, someone told me there was abuse, though.
I think Baez is a really good defense attorney. I think he is sneaky in a really sort of next level type way. I mean, this is such an interesting thing to do. And he knew he was doing it. I have watched Alice in another trial in which I was just a spectator. I wasn't on the team, where in the opening statement, opposing counsel made a promise. The defense counsel made a promise, and then they never fulfilled it. And then Alice and her co-counsel in the closing argument came back and pointed that out, that they said they were going to do this. They never did it. And the reason they didn't do it is because they couldn't do it, right? And that's a really powerful argument for the jury. Because as Alice said, ordinarily the defense has no obligation. The only obligation they have is the obligation they put on themselves, right? I mean, all the burden's on the prosecution. It's the prosecution's job to prove things. And the defense only has a burden if they say, hey, we're going to do this. And then when they don't do it, you can kind of use it against them, right? Well, obviously here the prosecution can't do that. The prosecution doesn't want to bring this back up in closing. They don't want to say, oh, he said all that about sexual abuse. He didn't bring any evidence, because they're hoping the jury will forget about it. But Baez, as Alice said, it's very clever, because by bringing this up and just putting it there in the forefront right at the beginning, he knows, or he has a pretty good idea, that George is going to be the first witness. George is the perfect first witness because he is the only person other than Casey. He's the last person to see Caylee alive. So you really need him to set the stage for that last day that anybody saw Caylee. You can start a case in all sorts of places, and that's when you have a big case like this with a lot of different places you could start. I mean, that's a big strategic decision. Like, how are you going to start? Who's going to be that first witness? And that first witness is really important. And right off the bat, Baez knows the jury, they're not going to just take everything George tells them at face value now. They automatically have doubt about what George is saying. They're looking at everything he does, the way he talks, every answer he gives. They're questioning everything about him from the very beginning. And this is really important because Baez, his entire case is that's the guy who covered it up. So if they doubt George at the very beginning, that doubt is going to seep through the entire case. It's always going to be in the back of the jury's mind. As we sort of close out here, we've been talking about why did the jury do what it did? What does reasonable doubt mean? It's really complicated. It's actually not as high a bar as a lot of people think it is. You hear things like shadow of a doubt or, no doubt, and that's not it. Reasonable doubt allows for some doubt. It's just you have to be beyond reasonable doubt. You have to be sure to the level you would be about making important decisions. Should I take that job? Should I buy that house? And in your mind, there's doubt, but really you know the right answer. You know the right answer is yes, right? It's the same thing here. Whenever you're making this huge decision about somebody's life, you can't help but have some doubt. If you didn't, you almost wouldn't be human. But what is beyond that sort of cloud of doubt that's not based on evidence and not based on argument? What is the evidence telling you? What is your heart telling you? That's sort of what you're looking for. And Baez wants the jury to have something they can anchor their doubt to. It's not just sort of residual doubt. It's, I really think she did it, but man, her dad, it just left me feeling weird. And George, and I don't know if Jose Baez just knew this from interacting with George, or whether Casey gave him this insight, or whether it was seeing George on the television, just the way George acted. Baez knew that George was going to come off as untruthful. And he does. If you watch him, and I can't point to what it is, watch the testimony. It's the first witness. So if you look up the Casey Anthony trial, the whole thing's on YouTube or various news channels. Watch him testify. There is something about him. And I actually am convinced that he is lying. I think he's lying about something. And I think the jury thought that too. I think the jury heard him and thought, he's lying about something. Not sure what it is, but he's lying about something. And what if it's what Baez told us? That he's way more involved in this, and this is way more complicated than the prosecution's making out. And I really feel like Baez almost won this case in the opening and with George being the first witness. I think the doubt that was in the jury's mind from that point forward never really went away.
Yeah, Brett, I think Baez really had interactions with George. He knew what George was like, and it doesn't take much time with George to have a sense, especially as an attorney, how he will come off on the stand. And he smartly latched his defense theory on George, because all you need is for George's testimony to be in question, which it was from the very beginning. And remember, in a couple episodes ago, we said that the jury was out for just 11 hours, which is a very short amount of time for a 6-week trial. And that we had hypothesized that meant that most of the jury had made up their minds to acquit Casey pretty early on in the trial. It may have happened, as Brett has suggested, as close to the first witness being George.
And what's really interesting about this, and I feel like this doesn't get talked about much. So George is the very first witness for the prosecution. Almost the very last witness for the defense is a woman named Crystal Holloway. So the whole case happens, everything we've talked about, testimony from various people, Casey's friends, the experts, Arpad Vass, all that stuff happens. And then the defense calls a woman named Crystal Holloway, a.k.a. River Cruz, which is quite the a.k.a. I'm not entirely sure why she came up with that one, but Crystal Holloway. So during the trial, the defense claims that George had actually had an affair with this woman, this Crystal Holloway. And Crystal had worked on the search for Caylee. She was a volunteer who was helping to look for Caylee. And at some point, George came into contact with her. Now, he claimed that she became a trusted friend who he felt he could rely on. He denied that he had an affair with her, although he could not deny that he texted her, for instance, "Just thinking about you. I need you in my life," and that he had visited her apartment and that he had dropped off a letter at her apartment for her, though he claimed that that was all that happened. Holloway told a very different story. She said that they had had an affair, they had slept together on multiple occasions, and that, yes, George had become very close to her and had, in fact, confided in her about what really happened to Caylee. Here's what she said. "He was sitting on my couch and I was sitting on the floor. He said it was an accident that snowballed out of control. I was in shock, and by the time I looked up, his eyes were filled with tears, and I didn't ask him anything further." So that is pretty powerful, right? So you have this woman who's saying she's having an affair with George. George becomes very close to her and confides in her. You have George's own words that he's thinking about her and needs her in his life. And that in this moment of weakness, George basically confirms the theory of the defense, that there had been an accident and that it snowballed and everything else that happened. So on cross-examination, this is a really interesting back and forth. If you get a chance to watch this, just from the perspective of how a direct and a cross go. On cross, the prosecution, they asked if, in fact, George had said, "I really believe it was an accident that spun out of control," and she, being Casey, decided to cover it up, which is quite different. So on the one hand, he's saying it was an accident that spun out of control, indicating he was part of the cover-up. The other version, he's saying what he believed, that he has come to the decision that there was an accident because he can't imagine Casey killing Caylee, and then she covered it up, right? So that's sort of how he's rationalized things. It's a very different statement. Now, Crystal denies this. She's like, "No, that's not what he said." At which point, in a very sort of standard, this is how you confront someone with a prior statement, the prosecution pulls out a statement that she made to the police, and they read the statement back to her. And when she talked to the police about this under oath, it was actually, I think, in a sworn deposition, she says the latter phrasing, that this is what George thought happened, not that he was there. Now, this is classic confrontation under the rules of evidence. Ordinarily, that out-of-court statement could not be introduced because it's hearsay, but you have her here testifying so you can ask her about it. And if she denies it, then you can confront her with the other statement. So now you can bring that statement in to confront her, and it comes in where it wouldn't normally come in under the hearsay rules. Now, she is adamant and quite emotional, if you watch the video, that maybe what is in the statement, but that's not what he said, that he said the former. There's a couple things that are interesting about this. Number one, her credibility was challenged in a few other ways. She had sold her story to the National Enquirer as well. She also had had some prior fraud charges, which obviously go to her truthfulness. It's also interesting that her statement, and this is like, we talk about this sometimes on our other podcast, Legal Briefs. We talk about the judge's instruction to the jury. So Crystal is called for the purpose of impeaching George's testimony. So George has said under cross-examination, he had nothing to do with this. He was not involved in any cover-up. He didn't do any of that stuff, right? So Crystal is being called to relay George's prior inconsistent statement to her. So his prior inconsistent statement, ordinarily that would be hearsay, right? Once again, it's George's out-of-court statement, which the defense wants to offer for the truth of the matter asserted, which was, I helped Casey cover it up. That's what they want to offer it for. Well, they can't offer it for that. All they can offer it for is to impeach George's in-trial testimony that he did not help cover it up. So they bring in the prior inconsistent statement through this witness to impeach George. And the judge gives an instruction to the jury that they can consider it when evaluating George's testimony, but not as actual evidence of what happened to Caylee. Now, if you think that's how the jury actually weighed that evidence, great. You and all the appellate courts in the country are in an agreement, but in reality, the jury heard it for what it was worth.
Absolutely. And this is fascinating. This is why words matter. And this is why preparing for your cross-examinations happen. So some of you who've watched trials before, you may think that the only preparation comes in when the attorney who's directing the witness is, has to prepare and how to get their story out there. But the art to cross-examination is having all of previous statements and everything you could potentially impeach the witness with in your back pocket at a moment's notice. It's actually a much more difficult task, I think, to cross-examine than to direct your witness, because when you direct a witness, you get to prep your witness, you work with them. In a lot of ways, you're kind of rehearsing the dance that you're going to do in court, and you're on the same team. For the most part, if you're calling the witness, for the most part, they're going to be friendly to you. Cross-examination, you have no idea what's going to come out of the mouth of the person sitting on the stand. And for the most part, they're going to be antagonistic to you, because your job, as they see it, and it is your job as the cross-examiner, to pick apart what they said. And so to know what Crystal had said, the exact wording from the previous statement, was very important. And to tease out for lay people what the difference in those two statements is very important. And remember, you're having to get this point across to an unwilling witness. But as Brett already said, even if it's not meant for the truth of the matter asserted, the jury absolutely hears what's being said, and it kind of sows that doubt again in their minds. Like, did George say that? Or did she mishear something? We all know how the game of telephone works, especially in an emotionally charged situation. So I thought this was a really effective cross-examination.
And then George is recalled to the stand. So George has to get back up there and testify about this. Jose Baez is questioning him. It's very hostile questioning, obviously. George denies the whole thing, says he didn't have an affair with her. She's lying about all of it. And, I mean, I don't know. You can watch it and decide for yourself. I mean, it seemed to me that George very clearly had an affair with this woman.
And that's what really cuts against his credibility, because maybe he did not say what Crystal is so adamant that he said. Not what she said in the previous testimony to police, but maybe what she testified to on the stand. But the jury is already kind of poised to disbelieve George because he can't deny these texts that so clearly indicate some sort of close relationship that is far beyond your normal friendly texts. And to not go the extra step and just admit that there had been an affair puts everything he says in a different light. And this is why we say impeachment doesn't just have to be about the specific facts that underlie the charges, because the purpose of impeachment is to show if someone's untrustworthy, you can't trust anything they say. And I think that had a real effect on the jury here. They're seeing these texts, and he's saying basically what? He went over to her apartment and did nothing? It seems very unbelievable.
And his testimony on this, it's classic. Just when you're caught in a lie, just admit it. Baez is like, did you have an affair with her? No, I did not. Well, you sent her this text, didn't you? And he says something like, well, I know that there has been evidence that has come out about a text. So, yes, I did. And it's like, oh, okay. So you wouldn't have admitted the text if you didn't already know that there's evidence in the text. So you have to admit the text. And then he says, she was a volunteer. I needed all the volunteers in my life. It's like, oh, come on, man. You didn't send every volunteer a text saying you need them in your life and that you were thinking about them. You weren't showing up at their apartment. You weren't writing them letters. You clearly had a relationship with this woman. And maybe she's exaggerating too. Maybe it didn't go all the way to a sexual relationship, but you clearly are underplaying it, and it just makes sense that you would have told secrets like this to this woman. And it would have been much better if George had said, I told her exactly what she said in that statement, that is what I thought happened. But he's not going to give anything on this, and I think that was a pretty bad place for the prosecution for the case to essentially end, bringing back that beginning, which was also a really bad place to start. So the prosecution, they're off their game at the very beginning because of this, and they're having to deal with this allegation, and then it wraps up with the same thing.
So because this trial has so many twists and turns, George isn't going to be the only person in this trial who's accused of sexual improprieties. Dominic Casey was a private investigator who worked for Casey's attorney, Jose Baez. As part of a later lawsuit, Dominic filed an affidavit stating that Baez had told him that Casey murdered and dumped the body somewhere. He wanted to find it before someone else did. Baez also stated that Casey had been having an affair with Baez, alleging he had walked in on Casey nude in Baez's office, which, if you don't know, is a big no-no. You cannot cross that attorney-client boundaries. And unsurprisingly, Baez denied the allegations without equivocation. He says that's a complete lie, never happened. I never said that Casey murdered and dumped Caylee's body somewhere. Casey and I never slept together. He never walked in on Casey nude in my office. All of it is just a lie.
And I don't know about Dominic Casey. A lot of people just run with this. This is true. I actually don't believe this. I think that Dominic says that Casey told him, well, how else am I going to pay for it? This is the way I'm going to have to pay for it, right? Well, the fact of the matter is what was really happening was Baez and Casey sold for several $100,000 photographs of Caylee in life to, I believe, ABC. And it is most likely the case that the way her defense was paid for was through that. That was the money that paid for Baez. It was the money that paid for Spitz and the other experts. She certainly wasn't sleeping with Dr. Spitz. You know, I mean, he got paid. And so I think this was, Baez said some things. I think he made some off-color jokes that were just that, but Dominic Casey kind of took it and ran with it. I think there is some truth to the dumping the body. We're going to talk about some other things that we know Casey said to her defense team, and I think this guy just kind of took all this and conflated it. Dominic Casey's involvement is sort of strange in this whole case, and it's you can't not mention this, I think, but I actually find this not to be maybe as believable as some people who really don't like Casey and really don't like Jose Baez just assume this is true. I think it's probably not true. Guys, we have got a very different kind of sponsor for this episode, The Jordan Harbinger Show, which is a podcast you really should be listening to. Jordan's show, which Apple named one of its best of 2018, is aimed at making you a better informed, more critical thinker so you can get a sense of how the world actually works and come to your own conclusions about what's happening, even inside your own brain. That kind of critical thinking and coming to conclusions on your own is something we support here on The Prosecutors, and Jordan's show is all about it. Each episode is a conversation with a different fascinating guest, and when I say there is something for everyone, I really mean it, particularly those of you who are fans of true crime. In one episode, Jordan talks to a hostage negotiator from the FBI who offers techniques on how to get people to like and trust you, which sounds useful and disturbing at the same time. Their interviews with Sammy the Bull Gravano or Amanda Knox, whatever you need to say your true crime interest. Jordan's always focused on pulling useful, practical insights out of his brilliant guest, and we're not talking about pop psychology or wishy-washy self-help stuff here. The episodes are loaded with bits of wisdom that you can use to legitimately change your mind and improve your life. We really enjoy this show, and we think you will as well. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's H-A-R-B as in boy, I-N as in Nancy, G-E-R on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies, all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play in comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Guys, if it hasn't been obvious, I have been sick for what seems like forever. I've had the sinus pain, I've had the congestion, the heaviness in the face and eyes, headaches, runny nose, watery eyes, all the things that come with having a cold or with having seasonal allergies. And I gotta tell you, one of the few things that worked for me was Tivic Clear Up. Tivic Clear Up is a revolutionary product that will change your life forever. It's an easy-to-use, FDA-approved medical device that fits in the palm of your hand. Created by doctors and neuroscientists, Tivic Clear Up stops suffering by using bioelectronic technology to reduce sinus pain and congestion. You simply glide Tivic Clear Up on areas of your face where you're experiencing sinus pain, and it will improve, or at least it did with me. Try Tivic Clear Up today with a 60-day risk-free trial. Go to tivichealth.com, that's TIVIC health.com, and enter promo code prosecutors22 to receive $20 off plus free shipping on your Clear Up device. I can tell you, Tivic Clear Up works when nothing else can. And now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Guys, it's been tough for everybody, and there is no shame in needing help. Needing to talk to somebody, needing someone that you can share your problems with. How we care for our minds affects how we experience life, and it is important to invest time and care into keeping them healthy. There are plenty of ways to support a healthy brain, learning new language, taking a power nap, but there's also BetterHelp online therapy. BetterHelp is online therapy that offers videos, phone, and even live chat-only therapy sessions. So you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. Look, everybody loves Zoom, but as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing more stressful than having to get on camera and talk to a stranger. If you don't want to do that with BetterHelp, you don't have to. And it's much more affordable than in-person therapy. You can be matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/prosecutors. I want you to check this out. If you've been having trouble, if you've been struggling and it's a tough time, check out betterhelp.com. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/prosecutors for 10% off your first month.
This case just has spun off the most bizarre twists and turns, and this doesn't even have really anything to do with Casey's trial, but like you said, it's worth mentioning.
So, that really is, it is far from everything you could talk about in this case. And this is another case, like all the great cases in true crime, where you could spend really as much time as you wanted to. We talked about True Crime Weekly, which is Stephanie Harlow's show. She does a great job on this case and just goes into exhaustive detail about the family and all that family dynamic. If this is something that interests you, I do recommend her show. And it's more parts than we're going to have, and each part's 2 hours long. So you can spend as much time as you want to on this case. But I think we have hit really the main things for you. And now we want to talk about the theories. And there are only a few. I think one that we just discard from the very beginning, this wasn't a stranger murder. Some of Casey's defense attorneys will still to this day act as if, well, maybe it was Kronk who did it. Kronk didn't do it, okay? This was either an accident that was covered up or it was a murder. It was one of the two. That's all the choices you have. And those are the theories we're going to talk about. So let's start with the defense theory. So the defense theory is that Caylee drowned in the family pool on accident and her father covered it up. This is the theory that was powerful enough for the jury that they would eventually acquit Casey. The question is, should they have? That's really what we're here to decide. Okay, so it's a little bit unclear who came up with this theory. Obviously, if it's just true, then I guess it would have been Casey, though we're going to talk about something in a second that undermines that. I think most likely this was Jose Baez who came up with this theory and ran with it. But what I think is pretty clear is that this version of the drowning story did not happen. So the story that was told in the opening statement is Casey's asleep. She always has Caylee in the bed with her to protect her from her father, to ensure that her father doesn't molest Caylee in the same way that he molested Casey, is what she says. So she sleeps in that day. She wakes up and Kaylee's not there. And all of a sudden, her father is barging into her room and wants to know where Caylee is. They start to look for her. They can't find her. And then they find her in the pool. She's drowned. She's dead. George freaks out. George says, your mother's never going to forgive you for this. How could you let this happen? You're going to go to jail for forever. Casey kind of breaks down. She doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know how to handle this. At some point, George says, I will handle it. And Casey says that he disposed of Caylee. Well, it depends on which story you believe. In one story, Casey just goes back to her room, goes to sleep, collapses, doesn't even know what's going on, and her father takes care of it. And she never really knows what he does. In another version of the story, which is more along the lines of what you see in the trial and with the trial testimony, is that George disposed of Caylee in the same way he would family pets, which is basically to put them in a bag or wrap them up with duct tape and then dispose of them. And this is supposed to kind of account for the duct tape somehow, that the duct tape somehow migrated from the bag to her face, right? I mean, the defense can never really explain how that happened or how that worked. That was part of Warner Spitz's Blood Money, where he comes in and gives this insane expert testimony about how somehow that could have happened, right? And it couldn't have been on her face because there's no DNA, so it must have been ended up there later, and maybe the police planted it. Who knows, right? So they're trying to figure that out, trying to give you some basis for that. But in any event, that is the theory. So how possible is that theory? Well, let's look back to the timeline. We know for sure that George left work around 2:30 that day and arrived around 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock is when his shift started. He was definitely at work. According to Marcia Clark, who is part of her show, I think on Investigation Discovery, she did an investigation of this case, and it's actually pretty good, and she came up with some stuff. For instance, she corrected the time. We talked about the time for foolproof suffocation. Jose Baez had originally said that happened at like 1:53. And through Marcia Clark's investigation, she was able to say, no, you're wrong. You got your times wrong. You're off by an hour. It actually happened at like 2:53 when the only person there was Casey. Pretty significant thing. She also apparently got George's phone records somehow. It's unclear how. But in doing that, was able to confirm really for the first time that George was at work that day at 2:30. So he wasn't hanging around the house. He definitely went to work as he said he did. So if he were involved in the cover-up, this whole thing would have had to have happened earlier in the day, which fits with the story itself. Remember, Casey saying she woke up, she slept in, but even Casey doesn't sleep in that late. So this would have still been 11 o'clock or something in the morning, right? So that's when it would have happened. So that's possible, that fits. But it doesn't line up with a few other things that seem to indicate that Caylee died later in the day, and we'll talk about some of those things in a second. Second, if George were involved in the cover-up, his behavior later on is entirely bizarre. Remember, it was George who initially said that he smelled a dead body in the car. Cindy, even though she went along with this after George said it, was willing to tell the police in her interview with them that she actually thought it was rotting pizza, which is silly. But nevertheless, she was willing to say it. But George, with very few exceptions, has been pretty adamant that he smelled a decaying body. It's what he said then. It's what he said on the stand. It's what he says now. If the purpose of disposing of Caylee had been to protect Casey, why would he indicate that Casey was involved in the disappearance and the death? Why would he indicate that there had been a body, and who else's body would it be, other than Caylee's in Casey's car? What would be the purpose for doing that? Did he change his mind? Had he gotten mad at Casey for some reason? And if that were the case, why did he attempt suicide after the body was found and not before? He would have known that Caylee was dead, and if he was going to kill himself over it, he doesn't have to wait for the body to be found. And he wrote a 5-page suicide note, and it's a rambling thing. And nowhere in that suicide note does he attempt to free Casey, which would have been pretty easy to do. All he has to do is in the suicide note say, I found Caylee drowned. I dumped her body. Now my poor daughter is suffering because of this, because I was too much of a coward to say what happened. That's all he had to do. He could have done a suicide note. He would be dead. Everybody would believe it, right? He didn't do that. And would he really let her, Casey, go to trial with the death penalty on the line? If she's convicted, she's getting the death penalty, and say nothing at any point. All he has to do is come forward and say it was an accident that he covered up. Whatever punishments there would be will be very mild compared to what is going to happen if Casey is found guilty. And remember, Casey's been in jail for like 4 years. She gets sentenced for lying to the police, and the reason she gets out fairly quickly is because she's served so much time already. So she's sitting in jail. George knows exactly what happened. Casey knows exactly what happened. And Casey never tells the police. She's willing to tell the story. She's going to tell it at trial. It's coming out in the opening statement. So it's not as if they're going to hide it. Why not tell it before? Baez was smart enough to know that if Caylee's death really was an accident and George had been the one to dispose of her, then it was George, not Casey, who was guilty. What do they have to lose? If the police don't believe them, you can go with the theory at trial. It was a surprise, quote unquote, but the prosecution knew they were going to do it. The prosecution knew they were going to lead with that. They'd already warned George about it. They knew about it when they were sitting in the courtroom that day. And all of this, it just doesn't make any sense that that's how George would act that whole time if he knew this was just an accident and now my daughter's on trial for first-degree murder.
So many questions. And again, Brett, these seem to be rational questions with rational answers. But remember who we're dealing with. Casey and George have acted in ways that really just defy all logic to, I think, most people who are watching. And so I don't know if all of these questions went through either of their minds. But you're right, from kind of a behavioral analysis perspective, it doesn't even make any sense. The point of the cover-up, as the defense wants you to believe, was for George to protect Casey. Yet here he is kind of letting Casey pay the ultimate price if she were found to be guilty. And even before that, that is a long time to spend locked up awaiting trial.
And then he gets on the stand. He's the first guy. I mean, once again, the whole purpose of the defense's theory is to give some doubt to the jury. The only evidence they can really produce is what this lady's going to say at the end. Imagine if George had gotten up on the stand and the first witness and said, no, that's not what happened. I mean, just imagine. I mean, the prosecution puts him up there and they start asking him, and he's like, I've got to tell the truth. This is what really happened. She drowned in the pool. I covered it up. Everything he said was true. I admit it. You know, he's crucified me in his opening. I have to come clean. I mean, if he'd have said that, the case would have been over right then. I mean, it would have been like the craziest thing ever, but there would have been no point in even continuing. And then you bring this lady in he had the affair with, and she's like, yeah, what he said is true, because that's the same thing he told me when we were having an affair. It's just the idea that George, they're all willing to lie. I mean, look, you have to believe, and maybe you can believe this, actually, because as you said, Alice, this is the craziest family ever. Maybe it was worth it to them to not admit that it was an accident that they covered up. And if that meant Casey had to die, so be it. You know, if she had to get the death penalty, fine. We're willing to do that to protect this lie. I mean, maybe that was how far they were willing to go, but it's hard to believe that even this screwed up family, with their bizarre sense of honor and public perception, would be willing to go that far in these circumstances to protect this lie.
Yeah, and also, let's remember something important. George was a cop. So, number one, he should know that Casey wasn't facing much of anything if they just called the authorities after the accident. He would also know that making the crime look like a murder dramatically increased the chances that Casey would indeed get charged with murder if the body was ever found. It's one thing to fake a kidnapping or disappearance and then dispose of the body. It's another thing altogether to fake a murder. Remember, they didn't just dump the body. They inexplicably placed duct tape over the little girl's mouth. And what exactly did that accomplish? How did it help Casey? If the body was found, as it was, she would be the first person under suspicion. Recall, Casey was charged with murder before the body was even found. George wasn't dumb enough to think they could pin this all on Zanny, even if she did kind of exist. Faking a murder in the hopes that if the body was found, someone other than the obvious suspect of the murder would be charged would be bizarre in the extreme. This is what George did as a living. He was a cop. He investigated these sorts of things. Here you have a young mother with no criminal history, and there is an accident while she's sleeping. It's not completely inconceivable you could be sleeping in late when she thought other adults were in the home to watch her child. She's probably not going to get much time at all. It would be such a tragic situation. The police would be devastated for the mother, for Caylee, and for the child, and for the entire family. It's a tragedy for the entire family. They wouldn't probably do much of anything to Caylee if that's really what happened, and he would have known that.
And this is kind of, I hate to keep going back to the Ramsey case, but there's so many sort of weird parallels to the Ramsey case. You know, you have to believe something similar if you think the Burke theory is true. You have to believe that the family, the 9-year-old, accidentally hurts his sister. And that the family's like, well, he hit his sister in the head. I guess we need to garrote her and fake a sexual assault to protect him. Right? And it's like, or you could just call an ambulance and say there was an accident. Or what? It makes more sense to stage a break-in, fashion a garrote out of a paintbrush and a piece of cord, wrap it around your daughter's throat until it's so deep that it makes like a 1/4-inch furrow and tangles her hair in it. Oh, and sexually assault her, and then stage that in the basement and then write a 5-page note. That makes more sense than just saying, oh, there was an accident with our 2 kids who have accidents all the time. Let's call the ambulance. And maybe, it'll just all work out, just like it did when he whacked her in the face with a golf club. But people actually believe that story, right? But you have to believe George is thinking something similar. Like, well, Caylee drowned in the pool, which is the leading cause of death of children in Florida. Pools. It's the leading cause of death in a lot of places. It's not all the other things you might think. It's pools. They're really dangerous. Everybody knows that. And you would think George, being a cop, he's in even better position than the Ramseys. He knows that. He's probably responded to child drownings before. He knows what happens to the parents who are involved, which is nothing, because it's an accident, and accidents happen, and you got to be really negligent to have anything happen to you. But if you then take that accident and rather than do what 100% of the parents would do in the situation when they find their child in the pool, which is call 911 and attempt to resuscitate them, instead, you stage a murder. You make the accident look like a murder so the police will think it's a murder if they ever find the body. It's just mind-blowing that you would do that. I mean, putting aside everything else we've talked about George's behavior, that is such a crazy thing to believe is possible that it's hard to imagine that any juror even had any doubt based on that was a possibility, that's what George had done.
Yeah. Whew. I mean, okay. And there's more to this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is George was not a moron. I mean, he could not dispose of the body within walking distance of the house. He would have taken the body much further away because of his police background. He would have been smart enough to know that the immediate area of the house would be the first place searched and also cause the most suspicion to point at someone within the family because it's so close. And it was one of the first places searched, even though the searchers and dogs did not find the body immediately. And perhaps most importantly, there is no physical evidence of George handling the body or of the body being in his car. There is, however, evidence that Caylee's body was in Casey's car. Even putting aside Vass and his experiments with the air in the jar, multiple people and dogs smelled the decomposition. And despite what Cindy said, no cop, or nurse for that matter, would mistake a rotting body for rotting pizza. However Caylee died, one thing seems to be certain. She was in the back of Casey's car at some point after she had died.
And I just want to note, somebody asked whether Cindy had actually had experience with this. And it said, well, she's a nurse, so most of her deaths are probably recent. Cindy actually said in a statement to the police that she had experience with bodies that had been in advanced states of decomposition. She had smelled this before, and that's why she thought it was a dead body. So she's on record saying that this is what she smelled. Now, she changes that to be like, oh, it's probably the pizza. Because, of course, Cindy's going to do whatever she has to do to protect her daughter. If it means, we talked about some of the searches. One of them was for neck breaking, which doesn't seem like the kind of thing that Cindy would search for. But in fact, that's what she testified to. Oh, that was my search, right? Like Cindy was absolutely willing to do whatever she needed to do to protect Casey, which is another reason. If George covered this up with Casey, she didn't know about it, because Cindy would have been like, let's just say that's what happened. I'm surprised Cindy didn't tell George to say that was what happened. Just get up there on the stand and lie about it. That was what Cindy would have done. If Cindy had been in a position to say, oh, I covered it up, she totally would have done that. She would have done it because she was fully committed. And to this day, when you watch Cindy and George talk about this, George is like, yeah, Casey killed her. I mean, that's George's position. He thinks it was some sort of weird accident, probably involving Xanax, but he thinks Casey killed her. Cindy probably still thinks it was Zanny, right? I mean, Cindy is like in La La Land. You can't get through to her. And it's one reason she still talks to Casey. George does not. George has no relationship with Casey. Cindy does. And I don't know. It's just one of those things where it is impossible to believe this story for so many reasons. This is a physical reason. So we've gone through a couple things on this. Number one, George's behavior after Caylee's disappearance, particularly after we know that Caylee has disappeared, is inexplicable if he was involved in this. It just makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. It is not consistent. It's just impossible to believe that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it doesn't make sense that George, as a cop, would do the things he would have had to have done to have been a part of this cover-up. Makes no sense. Almost impossible to believe. I don't think there's any way he would do that. And you have this physical evidence that puts Caylee's body in Casey's car. When you put those three things together, it really feels like this story as a whole begins to fall apart. But that's not even the biggest strike against the theory. The biggest strike against the theory, in my position at least, is what Casey told her defense team before trial. See, Casey, you got to imagine how this went down, right? Casey's all like, oh, it was Zanny. It was Zanny. Zanny had her. Zanny must have kidnapped her. I was told she was taken, and I don't know what happened after that. And it's pretty much what she still says publicly. Like, she's still on this, oh, she was taken by some third party. It wasn't Zanny, but it was somebody else, right? She's still living in that fantasy land. When she told Jose Baez that story, he said, well, that's a great story. That'll get you on death row. If you want to take the needle in Florida's death chamber, that's a great story to tell. You keep telling that story, right? There was no way Jose Baez was going with the somebody who doesn't even exist, kidnapped the daughter, killed her, put her in a bag that came from the house, and then dumped it walking distance from the house. He wasn't going to go with that. So he needed a different story. So Casey comes up with a different story. And it involves the drowning, but she tells some of her defense psychologists that, in fact, Caylee was murdered by George. That George, for reasons that are never really explained, it's sort of inexplicable, murdered Caylee by holding her under the water until she had drowned, and then attempted to convince Casey that it was some sort of accident. And Casey tells a story about how the top half of his shirt was soaking wet, and that was because he was holding her under the water, and that got the water on his shirt, though that would also be consistent with him getting her out of the water, but whatever. And that's the story that Casey tells. And I gotta think, Jose Baez, he hears that story and he thinks, another really dumb story from you, but there's a kernel there we can use. And I think that was the point when Jose Baez, combined with some things we're going to talk about in a second, thought this is a story that could work if it were an accident. If it were a true accident and Caylee was the one who put herself in that pool, and we don't have to do this whole stupid, it was George who did it, which doesn't even make sense. If we go with the accident, the pure accident theory, and then George is involved, but in the cover-up, that's a story we can sell. And I think that's when Baez comes up with this story. He knows the original story will never pass muster, but if you drop George as the murderer, make him the accomplice, and instead go with the accident theory, that's something we can sell. And that's the point when they decide that's what we're going with. And the fact that Casey's story starts the way it did pretty much tells you that the story they end up with isn't true.
Yeah, man. It's, we don't know exactly how the defense crafted its strategy, but kind of knowing the touch points that we do know exists for sure, you can kind of see the evolution of how this story came to be. And that's kind of what we were talking about earlier with his opening statement and him not even asking, him being Baez, never even asking George about the abuse, didn't create this theory out of either truth in the sense that Casey told it to him, nor is it based in evidence. But it was crafted to be the most believable story that would be sold to the jury and that they would buy it. And you know what? Whatever you think about Baez, it worked. I don't think they would have bought that George was a murderer. But this accident theory, like you said, the number one cause of death of children in Florida and in many places, in fact, is drowning in a pool. She often went in that pool. They had a pool in the backyard. This was something that anyone could put themselves in the place of, where this horrible accident could have happened. And they can put themselves into the mindset of going into protect your daughter mode when a terrible accident has happened and does another life need to be ruined. And it's just enough believability that it can be bought even without really any supporting evidence.
And I think there's two things that are really brilliant about this theory. Number one, people love statistics. They love them. You know, it's one reason that statistics, there are certain ways you can't use them in trial because they're so powerful and people love them so much that you can get people to convict people on the basis of statistics that don't actually prove anything about the case. So there are limitations to how you can use it. But think about it. This is one of those things where it's a statistic that everyone in that courtroom would have been familiar with. Everyone on that jury would know a story of a child who drowned in a pool. They might even know people who had kids who drowned in a pool or had a close call. They would have known that. It would have been something that was second nature to them. This is not a crazy theory. This is not an outlandish theory. You know, this is not something that requires you to jump through some conspiratorial hoop. You don't need police planning evidence. You don't need the second gunman on the grassy knoll. All you need is for something that happens every day in Florida to have happened and then people to have freaked out. Now, freaked out in a way that is unique. The prosecution tried to use their own stats. They actually had someone say, to your knowledge, in what percentage of drowning deaths do the parents attempt to hide the body? And the answer was 0. And it was that in 100% of drowning deaths, the parents attempt to call for help. Because, as we said before, parents never think their children are dead until someone makes them believe it. So they could find them drowning in that pool and they're trying to do CPR, they're calling the police, they're doing whatever they can, even if it is way past the possibility of saving them. And that's just the way people are. And the prosecution attempted to rebut this with their own sort of approach. And, you know, I guess you see how it worked out. So that's the first reason I think it's a really brilliant defense. The second reason is it gives the jury someone to blame other than Casey. They get to blame George, who is not likable and who they probably didn't like and who they thought was a liar, right? They had all these reasons not to like George. And then Jose Baez comes in and says, here's another reason. We're all here in this circus because George decided to cover this up. Because George was the one who said, essentially, we're not calling the cops. We're not telling your mom. We're going to cover this up. And I think giving them someone else to blame besides the obvious person, besides Casey, was really powerful. So, Alice, we've gotten through exactly one theory in this hour of conversation about Casey Anthony. So it appears that my initial estimation of 6 episodes was, in fact, incorrect. I think this is going to take a 7th one for us to get into some more theories. We're not done. There is another accident theory we want to talk about that's going to take us a while to talk about. The one that I think people don't talk about that is much more likely than the one we just covered. And then, of course, the murder theory, what we think actually happened, and a little bit more about this jury and their psychology and why they ended up where they are. And we can't do that in the next 10 minutes. So I think we are going to take this into overtime. We're going to part 7.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. And I hope nobody's disappointed. I hope nobody was hoping we'd wrap up today, because we are not. Well, I think this was interesting. I hope you do too. I'd love to hear what you think about this theory, what you think about George, what you think about his testimony, how this theory affected the jury. If our discussion of it gives you any pause to think, well, maybe this was something the jury should consider. Just interested to hear what you think about it in general. Hit us up, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod. For all your social media, we're on Facebook. Join the gallery, which is our discussion group on Facebook. There's a ton of good discussion about this case and all the cases we cover. I hope you guys are listening to Legal Briefs, our other podcast where we talk about legal issues. We talk about things like hearsay in depth and habeas corpus, ineffective assistance of counsel, all those legal nerd things you like to hear. And we talk about current cases, current true crime cases, current developments in the law in 30-minute bites. So it's not this long, drawn-out thing, 7-part episodes on everything like we do here. Something different. I think you'll enjoy it. And thank you, as always, to our patrons who are getting this early and ad-free. We love you guys, and we appreciate you so much. Well, Alice, is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up for this week and then finish this case up next week?
Oh, at the beginning of this episode, when you said we were going to finish up, I didn't think it was possible. We've only gotten through maybe a page of our notes in this episode, and that's just because there's so much to discuss. And I'm glad we're not rushing through this because we are finally getting to the meat and the question that you all wanted to know, which is, with such obvious evidence pointing to Casey's involvement, how was she acquitted? And acquitted in just 11 hours after such a long trial. And we're going to try our best to answer that question in the next episode. So come back.
That's right. We are. And, you know, I'm just done with apologizing for our long-windedness. I think if you're still with us 100 and some episodes into it, you probably like this stuff. So, well, we are done for today, but we'll be back next week with another episode, the final episode, I promise, no matter what, no matter how long it takes, on Casey Anthony. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. So I think, here's what I think we should do. I think we should talk tonight until we're done.
Okay. And then
I think we look at how long it is. And if it's one episode, we do one episode.
Okay.
If it's like, could be 2, then we can add more and make it 2. So no rush, just taking it easy.
I am easy peasy. Extra squeezy.
You are easy peasy. Extra squeezy. Hopefully our close contact doesn't give you mono. I don't really know.
I don't know how mono.
Does it only spread through like liquid? Is it airborne?
I mean, that's...
I know they call it the kissing disease.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't that why they call it the kissing disease? But I have no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fine. I completely resolved myself to getting whatever you had.
And yet you didn't.
Slash.
You have an immune system.
All this month, stream the funniest films for free on Pluto TV. Watch comedy classics like Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, and Mean Girls. Or drop in for a Tyler Perry marathon with a Medea family funeral and Medea's witness protection. Pluto TV also has hundreds of channels and thousands of movies and TV shows like Get Shorty, Be Cool, Key and Peele, Comedy in Color, and more. And no contracts, no subscriptions, no fees. No joke. So download the Pluto TV app on your favorite streaming device and start laughing today. Pluto TV. Drop in, watch free.